What if I told you that everything you think you know about vampires is wrong? Forget Dracula, forget Transylvania's Gothic castles and the suave, cape-wearing count. The real vampire legend didn't start in some dusty Victorian novel. It started in the villages of Romania, whispered around fires, passed down through generations who actually believed these creatures walked among them. And the truth? It's so much darker than anything Hollywood ever showed you. This is the story of the Strigoi, the original vampire. And once you hear what they really are, you'll never look at vampire stories the same way again. So here's the thing about vampires that nobody tells you. When Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1897, he didn't invent vampires. He just borrowed them. He took bits and pieces from Eastern European folklore, wrapped them up in a Gothic horror package, and sold it to the West. But the Strigoi, they were already terrifying Romanian villages centuries before Stoker ever put pen to paper. The word Strigoi comes from the Romanian word striga, which means to scream. And that should tell you something right there. These weren't romantic figures lurking in shadows, waiting to seduce you. They were screaming, violent, horrifying things that came back from the dead with one purpose: to drain the life from the living. But let me back up a second. Because to understand the Strigoi, you need to understand where they came from. And that story starts in the countryside of Romania, in places where life was hard, death came early, and the line between the living and the dead wasn't always clear. Picture this. It's the 1600s, maybe the 1700s. You're living in a small Romanian village. Your whole world is maybe a few hundred people. Everyone knows everyone. Your days are spent working the land, trying to survive brutal winters, avoiding disease, and hoping you live long enough to see your children grow up. Life expectancy? Maybe 30 or 40 years if you're lucky. People die all the time. Children die. Mothers die in childbirth. Men die from injury or illness. Death is just part of life. But here's the problem. Sometimes, after someone died, weird things started happening. Maybe the crops would fail. Maybe livestock would get sick and die. Maybe people in the village would start having nightmares, all of them the same nightmare, about the person who just died standing at the foot of their bed, watching them. Or maybe someone else in the village would suddenly fall ill with no explanation, wasting away, getting paler and weaker each day like something was sucking the life right out of them. And the villagers would start to wonder, they'd start to whisper. Because in their minds, there was only one explanation for all of this. The dead person hadn't really left. They'd come back as a Strigoi. Now, according to Romanian folklore, there were two types of Strigoi. Strigoi V, which means living Strigoi, and Strigoi Morti, which means dead Strigoi. And both were terrifying in their own ways. The Strigoi Ziks were people who were born with certain signs that marked them as future vampires. Maybe they were born with a caul, which is a piece of the amniotic sac still covering their head. Maybe they were the seventh child in a family. Maybe they had red hair and blue eyes, or a tail, or extra hair. These were all signs that when this person died, they would come back as a vampire. So even while they were alive, people watched them with suspicion. They were marked, cursed. But it wasn't just birth defects or family position that could doom you. You could also become a Strigoi if you'd lived a sinful life, if you practiced witchcraft, if you died unbaptized, if you committed suicide, if you broke an oath, if you died violently or unexpectedly. All of these things meant your soul couldn't rest, and a soul that can't rest, it comes back. That's the Strigoi Morti, the dead vampire. And this is where things get really dark, because according to the folklore, when someone became a Strigoi Morti, their body didn't just rot in the grave like it was supposed to. The corpse would remain preserved, sometimes for months or even years. The hair and nails would keep growing. The body would be bloated, filled with blood. If you opened the coffin, you might find the corpse in a different position than when it was buried. The mouth might be stained red. The skin might look flushed, almost alive. To the villagers, this was proof. Proof that the dead weren't really dead. Proof that something unholy was happening in that grave. And at night, the Strigoi would rise. They'd claw their way out of the earth, dirt under their nails, and they'd walk back to the village they came from. They'd go to the homes of their relatives first, their family, the people they loved in life, and they'd drain them. But here's where the Strigoi legend gets different from what you know about vampires. These creatures didn't just drink blood. They drank life. They could drain your energy, your vitality, your very soul without ever touching you. You'd wake up exhausted, weak, feeling like something had been taken from you in the night. And each night, you'd get worse, paler, thinner, sicker. Until eventually, you'd die. And then you'd become a Strigoi too. It's a plague, a curse that spreads through families, through villages, turning the dead into predators and the living into victims. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is just superstition. People didn't understand decomposition. They didn't understand disease. They made up stories to explain things they couldn't understand. And yeah, you're partially right. But here's the thing that makes the Strigoi legend so fascinating and so disturbing. The people believed it so much that they took action. Real, physical action. And what they did to suspected Strigoi corpses is the stuff of nightmares. If a village suspected that someone had become a Strigoi, they wouldn't just sit around and wait for more people to die. They'd dig up the grave. They'd exhume the body, sometimes just days after burial, and they'd examine it. They'd look for those signs of vampirism, the preserved flesh, the blood in the mouth, the bloated body. And if they found what they were looking for, they'd perform a ritual to destroy the Strigoi for good. Different regions had different methods, but they were all brutal. Sometimes, they'd drive a stake through the heart. Not a neat little wooden stake like you see in the movies. We're talking about a thick iron or wooden stake, driven through the chest with a hammer, pinning the corpse to the ground so it couldn't rise again. Sometimes they'd cut off the head and place it between the corpse's legs, or bury it separately. Sometimes they'd cut out the heart, burn it, and mix the ashes with water for the sick villagers to drink. They believed this would cure anyone the Strigoi had already drained. Sometimes they had stuffed the mouth with garlic or put a coin on the tongue to prevent the vampire from screaming or speaking. Sometimes they'd turn the body face down in the grave, so if it tried to dig its way out, it would only dig deeper into the earth. And sometimes, if the Strigoi was considered especially dangerous, they'd burn the entire body. Reduce it to ash, scatter the ashes, make sure there was nothing left to come back. This wasn't rare. This wasn't some one-time thing that happened in a single village. There are documented cases of this happening all across Romania and the surrounding regions well into the 1800s. In some places, it happened into the early 1900s. These weren't ancient practices. These were real events, carried out by real people who genuinely believed they were protecting their communities from supernatural evil. One of the most famous cases happened in the village of Medvedja in Serbia in 1731. A man named Arnold Paula died in a farming accident. A few weeks later, people started dying. They reported nightmares of Arnold visiting them at night. They felt weak, drained. 4 people died within weeks of each other. The villagers panicked. They dug up Arnold's body. According to the reports, his corpse showed all the signs of vampirism. Fresh blood in the mouth. No decomposition. The body looked almost alive. So they drove a stake through his heart, and according to witnesses, the corpse let out a scream and blood gushed from the wound. They thought that was the end of it. But then more people died, And the villagers realized that the people Arnold had killed had also become vampires, so they dug up those bodies too. In the end, they exhumed and mutilated 17 corpses. 17 suspected vampires, all from one village, all within a few months. This case became so famous that it was documented in official Austrian military reports. It was investigated by military physicians and officials. It's one of the most well-documented cases of vampire panic in history, and it shows you just how real this was to the people living through it. Because while we can look back now and explain away a lot of this stuff with science, there are aspects of the Strigoi legend that are harder to dismiss. For example, the Strigoi were said to be able to shapeshift. They could turn into mist or shadows. They could become invisible. And there are accounts, hundreds of accounts, of people claiming they saw these transformations happen. Now, you could say it's mass hysteria. You could say it's fear and superstition playing tricks on people's minds. But when entire villages, entire communities report the same things over and over again across centuries, it makes you wonder, what were they really seeing? What were they really experiencing? There's also the question of the energy draining, and that's something that people report even today. Feeling inexplicably exhausted, feeling like something is feeding on them, waking up weaker than when they went to sleep. In Romanian folklore, the Strigoi could attack you without ever physically touching you. They could invade your dreams. They could drain you from across the room, across the village, a reason to target you. And once they did, you were marked. And here's maybe the scariest part of the Strigoi legend. They retained their personality. Unlike the mindless zombies or the sophisticated aristocratic vampires of modern fiction, the Strigoi were said to be exactly who they were in life, just twisted. If they hated you when they were alive, they'd come for you first when they were dead. If they loved you, they might drain you without malice, just because they couldn't help it. This made them deeply personal. These weren't random monsters. They were your neighbor, your parent, your child, someone you knew, someone you loved. And now they were back, and they wanted something from you that would kill you. That psychological horror is something that most modern vampire stories miss. The Strigoi weren't strangers. They were family, and that made them so much worse. Now, as time went on, the Strigoi legend evolved. In others, they could walk in daylight. They just preferred the dark. In some versions, they could be repelled by garlic, holy water, or religious symbols. In others, these things did nothing. In some stories, they cast no reflection and no shadow. In others, they looked completely human. The one thing that stayed consistent was their danger. They were always predators. They were always a threat. When Christianity spread through Romania, the church tried to combat these beliefs. Priests would bless graves, perform exorcisms, and preach that the dead stayed dead. But the Strigoi legend was too deeply rooted, so instead of erasing it, Christianity absorbed it. The Strigoi became associated with the devil, with demonic possession, with sin. The rituals to destroy them started including prayers and holy water alongside the stakes and fire. But the belief never really went away. Even today, in rural parts of Romania and the surrounding countries, there are people who believe in the Strigoi. There are still cases, rare but documented, of people exhuming bodies because they believe a vampire is responsible for illness or bad luck in their community. As recently as 2004, there was a case in Romania where a family dug up a dead relative, cut out his heart, burned it, and drank the ashes mixed with water, because they believed he had become a Strigoi and was making them sick. The government prosecuted them for desecrating a corpse, but to that family, they weren't criminals. They were survivors. They were doing what generations of their ancestors had done to protect themselves from the undead. And that brings us back to Dracula, because when Bram Stoker was researching his novel, he came across these legends. He read about the Strigoi, about the vampires of Eastern Europe, and he took the core ideas. The undead rising from graves, the blood drinking, the stakes through the heart, the aversion to garlic and holy symbols, the shape-shifting into wolves and bats. All of that came from Romanian and Slavic folklore. But he sanitized it. He made it gothic and romantic. He gave it a castle and a count and a tragic backstory. He turned the Strigoi, which were rotting corpses crawling out of graves to drain their own families, into a sophisticated, almost sympathetic villain. And in doing so, he created the modern vampire. The one we know today. The sexy vampire. The tortured vampire. The vampire with a moral code. But the Strigoi, they weren't any of those things. They were pure horror. They were the fear of death itself. The fear that the people we love might not stay gone. The fear that something unnatural could break into our world and destroy everything we hold dear. That's the real vampire myth, not a romantic figure in a cape, not a misunderstood immortal looking for love, but a screaming, violent, relentless thing that comes back from death to feed on the living. A creature born from fear, from death, from the belief that some sins are so terrible that not even the grave can contain them. And that's why the Strigoi legend has survived for so long, because it taps into something primal, something we all fear on some level. The fear that death isn't the end, that the people we bury might not stay buried, that the darkness might have teeth. So the next time you watch a vampire movie or read a vampire novel, remember where it all came from. Remember the villages in Romania where people dug up their dead and drove stakes through their hearts. Remember the families who burned the hearts of their loved ones and drank the ashes to survive. Remember the Strigoi, because the vampire myth didn't start with Dracula. It didn't start in a Gothic novel written for Victorian audiences. It started in the dirt and the blood and the terror of people who believed they were fighting for their lives against the dead who would not stay dead. The original vampire wasn't a count in a castle. It was your neighbor, crawling out of their grave at night, still wearing the clothes they were buried in, coming back to the home they once lived in, standing at the foot of your bed, watching you sleep, waiting to drain the life from you bit by bit until you joined them in the earth. That's the real vampire. And that's the legend that haunted Romania for centuries. Because Dracula is fiction. But the Strigoi, people really believed in them. People really fought them. People really died because of them, one way or another. Its entire communities organizing around a shared terror, trying to protect themselves from something they couldn't understand but knew in their bones was real. And even though we can explain away a lot of it now with science, with our understanding of decomposition and disease and psychological phenomena, there's still something about the Strigoi legend that lingers. Something that makes you think twice before dismissing it completely. What if the people who believed in the Strigoi, who saw the signs, who performed the rituals, weren't all just superstitious and scared? What if they knew something we've forgotten? And that's why, even today, in the 21st century, there are still people in Romania who won't say the name Strigoi out loud at night, who still put garlic around their doors, who still bury their dead with precautions just in case, because some fears are too old, too deep, to ever really die. Some stories are too powerful to fade away, and some legends are too real to ever fully dismiss. The Strigoi are one of those legends. And now you know the truth about where vampires really came from. Not from Transylvania's Gothic castles, not from Bram Stoker's imagination, but from the villages of Romania, from the fields and forests where people lived and died, and sometimes came back. From the earth itself, from the darkness, from the oldest human fear of all, that death might not be the end. That's the vampire myth. That's the Strigoi. And that's a story that will never really die. Because as long as people fear death, as long as we bury our loved ones and wonder what happens next, As long as we lie awake at night and feel like something is watching us from the shadows, the Strigoi will be there, waiting, watching, hungry. And that's the real vampire story. The one that started it all. The one that's so much darker than anything Hollywood ever showed you. The one that's real enough, even now, to make you check the shadows before you go to sleep tonight. Sweet dreams.